So guys, welcome along to the Diabetes Chat. This week we have Professor May Ung as our guest speaker. She is a Honorable Professor and Consultant Paediatric Endocrinologist. Professor May completed her undergraduate degree under full scholarship in Sydney, Australia, and was the recipient of the UK Medical Research Council Fellowship. She further obtained a Master's and PhD degree in Paediatric Endocrinology and Diabetes in the UK. She also has a Master's of Law and an MBA in Healthcare and Finance Management. Professor May has published over 200 amazing research papers and authored 3 books that we'll talk a little about this evening. Some of Professor May's roles include Chair of the UK Association of Children's Diabetes Clinicians, and is voluntary Chief Medical Advisor for Action for Diabetes, and we'll be talking about Action for Diabetes this evening as well. May was awarded in 2022, last year, an OBE at the Platinum Jubilee Queen Elizabeth Honours for her amazing services to people with diabetes and people with autism and disabilities. Also, May has been recipient of lots of amazing awards, including the Diabetes UK Arnold Bloom Award just recently, and the winner of the Northwest Excellence in Healthcare NHS Parliamentary Award in 2020. So lots and lots to talk about this evening. I am truly honoured to have Professor May Ung here as our guest speaker. Hello to you, May.
Hello, thank you, Tom, for inviting me. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, all good. Great. This is your first Twitter space, right?
It is. Very unusual. Thank you.
You are very welcome. It's going to be a really fascinating chat. And like Gary said, we've got a few sections tonight over the course of the next hour, talking about your connection to diabetes and your career background. We're going to talk a little bit about your research and your books and Action for Diabetes that I mentioned, the amazing OBE, of course. And then I know that we'll hopefully talk a little bit about the NICE project for CGM for all and the health inequalities to tech, which kind of, I guess, follows the sort of conversation that we've already had this evening. And then to finish, we'll just have a few questions around mental health and peer support. So let's crack on. So welcome to the Diabetes Chat, May. It's lovely to have you. Myself, Gary and Kez will be leading this evening, but you guys get involved. Hashtag Diabetes Chat, send a message, a comment or a question to May. This is your opportunity to do it tonight, or you can request the microphone and jump on and come ask a question to May. I'm sure that'd be absolutely fine. But I'm going to head over to Kez and she's going to do our first section, which is a sort of fun, quick fire round questions that we ask our guest speakers, and primarily we get guest speakers who have diabetes, but tonight we're going to ask you some questions that might be interesting. So I'll head over to Kez.
Hello.
Kez.
Hi. Yeah, so I'm going to do the 90-second questions. So like Tom said, they're just quick fire questions, just a little bit of fun and help us to get to know you a bit better.
Okay.
So we'll make a start. So the first question is, what is your name and occupation?
May Ung, and a consultant pediatric endocrinologist.
Okay. And if you were a diabetic, what would your go-to hypo?
Glucose tablets.
Oh, okay. Any particular flavour?
No, as long as it does the job.
Okay, fair enough. Third question is, if you had the choice of insulin pens or a pump, what would be your preference and why?
I think that's individual, but for me, if I had the choice and if I was a type 1 diabetic, I would choose the pump just because it's more flexible.
And what do you think might feel worse, having a hypo or a hyper?
Again, I don't have it. I can't speak for someone else who actually experiences it. So, but I have done a virtual reality kind of experience, and I think a hypo is really not a nice thing to have. So that's just from an experience via VR.
So the next few questions are kind of all linked, I suppose. So the first being, what is one thing you like about diabetes or the world of diabetes?
Gosh, I have been looking after families and children with diabetes for 30 years, and I think it's an incredible journey from the start. I think people have the passion and motivations throughout their lives to actually live well with diabetes. So I've always admired it.
Okay. And what is one thing that you'd say you don't like about diabetes?
Well, I don't like having to tell someone there's a cure in the next 10 years, because I've said that for 30 years. So I've stopped saying it now.
The future does look slightly optimistic, though, May.
I know, I'm right there in the global research, but yeah, we
Yeah,
don't know. There's too much happening, too much unknowns.
Definitely. Okay, the next one is, do you love or hate the smell of insulin?
I'm ambivalent. I think I smell it so much for 30 years.
Become immune.
Yeah.
Okay, and finally, just a bit of a fun one. If you were on a desert island, what 3 things would you take with you?
And that is if I have type 1 diabetes.
Or not. It doesn't have to be. It could just be anything.
Oh, okay. If I'm just me, I have some chocolates, a book, and music. And then when it all dies off, then I'm happy to go.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so that's the 90-second questions done. So I'm going to hand over to Gary for part 2 of the discussion this evening.
Thank you, Kez. I do not know how I'm going to follow on from that because you just made it sound so fun and seamless. But I will try and keep this bit light-hearted and fun for you, Professor May, and try and get to know a little bit more about you. So I'm just going to look into the connection you have with diabetes and a little bit into your career background. And I am going to say I have had a look at your career background and I am fascinated with how much you have done. All the qualifications you've got, all the awards and honorary things that you've managed to gain throughout your wonderful career in diabetes, as we can see. So what I am going to start is, as an honorary professor and consultant in paediatric endocrinology, what made you fall into that career? What caught your heart with it? Was it something that touched you, or was it just something you always had an interest in?
That's an interesting question. I just did an interview last month with the Lancet, so you might see some of these answers coming through in one of the Lancet profiles. But I've always wanted to look after children since I was about 6 years old and knew what a pediatrician was. And my answer would be not, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a pediatrician. So that was fascinating to some people. And my career just headed that way. I won a scholarship when I was 13 to go to Singapore from Malaysia. They're different countries, by the way. But yeah, so I went to Singapore on a full, what we call ASEAN Southeast Asian scholarship to study in Singapore. So I studied the GCE at the time, GCE O levels and GCE A levels under the Singapore government on scholarship. And I then was one of the first Chinese Malaysian students to get a full scholarship to read medicine in Sydney, Australia. And during that time, I like I said, I was stuck in my ways. I've gone straight into a path towards pediatrics. I won the pediatric prize in university when I graduated. I graduated with honors, and one of my first jobs was really just doing pediatrics after internship or housemanship in Australia, in Sydney, and then in Tasmania. My initial specialty was in pediatric oncology, which is cancers, children with cancers, and I stuck with it for 2 years, but it was very difficult. I found it was, yeah, I didn't think I could carry on that career path because you really have to be slightly away from to be a really good pediatrician, and I couldn't do it. So then I moved away, and my first job in the UK, because I wanted to travel a bit from Australia, was in Alderhay at the time. And my first job was as a junior doctor in endocrinology and diabetes.
Yeah.
And I really loved it. So this was a long time ago, over 30 years ago. And I thought, hey, chronic conditions are something that fascinated me because, I mean, at the time, there were 2 conditions in pediatrics which people used to say were the most challenging in terms of chronic conditions. Was it cystic fibrosis or type 1 diabetes? And both are incredibly challenging. Both affects, long-term and daily life. And I looked after children with type 1 diabetes, and I found that I did fairly well in terms of communicating and being able to offer that little bit more with regards to being the doctor, as well as giving them that extra support, I suppose. I don't know what you call it at the time, but I found that chronic conditions works well with me in terms of where I was going to be headed towards as a destination career. So I stuck to it, and as a medical student, I had already published 3 papers in pediatric oncology. So that was a waste, I thought. but then I, very early on in my junior doctor career years, started doing research in endocrinology and then later in diabetes. And as the introduction earlier, I then gained I was very lucky to get a full grant, a National Medical Research Council grant, to run a national trial on randomized controlled trial of thyroxine in extremely premature babies. So I was traveling across the country running this trial. This was a grant that I held, and that was part of my PhD. Prior to that, I did a master's while being a full-time junior doctor, and I did my MSc in diabetes and endocrinology, and I really loved it. So I carried on this path in pediatric diabetes and endocrinology, and finally became a consultant. But I was at crossroads at the time that I was going to take up an academic post or not. So I had my first son, Brendan. He was 2 or 3 at the time, and was diagnosed with they used to call it severe autism, but now it's called high support needs autism. And he needed a lot of therapies, and I had to make a choice about whether I needed to travel 3 hours a day up and down tertiary hospitals or stay closer to home. And I made that choice. So I took up a post in Southport and Ormskirk, which was great because I could concentrate, being closer to home, etc. And at the time, my second son was also diagnosed with congenital deafness. So he was born deaf, but we found out about a year later. So I had 2 little boys who was non-verbal, and my husband and I, we had to learn British Sign Language, do lots of therapies at home, come into the right schools. That was the inspiration, after 10 years of my first book, A Journey with Brendan. And my third child, Kareem, she was born premature at the end of my PhD of studying extreme prematurity. So she was born premature. God has his funny ways. But so I had 3 kids under 5 who needed me quite a lot. But I love my career. I love doing the job that I do. So I managed, with a lot of help, with support from my partner. With my mum was here for 3 years helping me out. So yeah, that's kind of my career background. And when I first got the job at Southport and Ormskirk, I was the only consultant looking after all the children with diabetes without a nurse. It's like, whoa, okay.
That must have been very challenging, I can imagine,
Yes,
because
yes. But this was a long time ago, 15,
Yeah.
16 years ago. And yeah, and no one was given pumps at the time, and they were referred quite far away to have pumps. So there was a lot of changes that needed to be made, and I'm glad within 6-7 years we did really well. The team grew. We now have 3 full-time nurses, an educator, a full-time dietitian, 2 psychologists, training. So we have a fantastic team that, as you said, we've won many awards, but actually the team has won it as well.
And can I just say, it is fantastic to hear how much passion you have for diabetes and how much passion you have for your family and the amount of care you put into your family. But also, it's just amazes me and how much care you can hear from just speaking to you, how much care you have for your patients, and for not just your patients, for your team and everything. It's true leadership you can see there. You can just hear it, and I'm going to say you need to be very cautious about what you're telling us what your hospital's got, because you might find that you see a lot of new patients arrive, because we want to have a doctor that is as passionate about diabetes and is passionate about diabetic care and their patients as much. And I'm not saying every doctor's not like that, but there is, when you find a good doctor, you just know you've got a good doctor, and you can hear that from yourself, and just how much you love and respect the profession, and how much you love and respect your patients in terms of caring for them. So another thing that I would love to know a little bit more about in terms of, what is your biggest career highlight? So I know that you've had a lot of grants and a lot of awards with your team. What would you say was the biggest highlight for yourself and your team as well? Because I know that you pay a lot of respect to your team, as you can hear there, and you put a lot of onus on the team, helped get the awards as well. And so what is your biggest career highlight from that, would you say?
I never thought of that, Gary, so I don't know is the answer. I've always said to my team that everyone is equal. We have an open space. Everyone is innovative. When someone brings in an idea, we all take that along. And that's the importance of working together as a team. No one can be in silo. No one can be a solo person. I have the benefit, because I have 2 children with special needs who needs a lot of extra help. I think sometimes that maybe that's the empathy or the understanding, when I can understand how families are challenged when they have a child, or they themselves have something more that needs to be taken care of other than. So yet I don't, the biggest surprise was probably the OBE. I was like, oh, that was nice. Who did that? So I still don't know, but I can guess, I suppose, because I've been fundraising for as long as I can remember. When I started as a consultant, I said to the manager, why can't I buy some biscuits for the evening carb counting education I'm holding? Why can't we have a bit of kitty money? She went, no, there's no money. So I set up within the first year our Paediatric Diabetes Charitable Funds. Over the years, we've raised 20,000, and that pays for all the educational resources that we use. It pays for all the annual carb counting evening we hold. It pays for the superheroes, evenings that we hold for the under 5s. It pays for the Tree of Life sessions that we hold. So I don't have to beg anyone for money. But at the same time, I am passionate about autism as well. So we've been raising money as a family for National Autistic Society, probably more than 25,000 now. But every year my kids go, oh, do we have to run that 100K? And I'm like, yes, we do. So But yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, I write that in my book, how important it is to have awareness for autism. I have had, nasty comments, stares, for being told I'm a bad parent because I can't, control my temper tantrum son. But, it's not a temper tantrum, it's a meltdown. It's, he's got autism. Back then, there was less awareness. There's a lot more awareness now. I've been kicked out of a cinema before. I've been kicked out of a children's group before. And Brendan hasn't been able to go to swimming lessons, so we've had to teach him ourselves. So there's so many examples of why I'm passionate about autism inclusion or autism awareness. But that's my personal story, I suppose. And some of it is in the book. For diabetes, it's very similar. I think I find very similarities of acceptance, awareness, Yeah.
Yeah, and can I just say that if anybody's ever saying to anybody that they're a bad parent, that it shocks me that people have that sort of attitude. It shocks me that people want to have that attitude, because it's a case of education. People need to go look up things and read about things. There's a lot of things that I don't know about autism, but I would go and specifically look about it, because I have friends that have got kids that have got autism, and I go and look up things like this because you can't judge somebody. And can I just say that your kids must be super proud of you for all the work you do, and I am sure that your kids see how much love you have, not just for them but for your work, and how much love you have for a community of people with diabetes, people with autism, and people with deafness and things. And I think that just highlights just how much respect you have for social justice for everybody as well. And I think that is a big thing, because you can hear you're trying to fight these stigmas, and you're trying to remove barriers so that people can understand these complex issues and these complex conditions that are challenging, and people just look at it tunnel vision and don't look at it holistically. And I really respect that you're trying to get people to view all these things as more holistically and understand about them. And I just want to, and I'm sure everybody on this panel just wants to say thank you for all the work you're doing, not only for diabetes, but for autism, for deafness, and all these disabilities that are complex and challenging. That I just want to say thank you for that. And I don't have the words in how grateful I am to hear somebody like yourself that wants to create this more equal world and more equal opportunities, and help remove these barriers. And I can't find the words, and I'm like, it just fills my heart with joy that there's somebody out there that is trying to help marginalized communities and marginalized people feel like that they have a space where they can feel comfortable and open and feel welcomed. And you've filled me with joy just hearing all these things you've said. So there's only another couple of things that I want to ask about, because we've went through quite a lot of things. So, and I think the last thing I want to really ask is, what would you like to see in the future happen for diabetes, but also where do you see your future in diabetes going, and also in autism and deafness? Because I think it's something that we all want to know. Where do you see yourself in the future with this, in employment or social justice or things like that? How do you see this going for you?
It's an odd question, because I don't set out to go and seek them.
Okay.
So I did my PhD, I did my law master's because I happened to get involved in medical legal expert in pediatric diabetes and endocrinology, because no one was doing it. As of today, I think there's less than 10 of us in the whole country, and I'm probably the youngest one. So I did the law because I needed to fight the barristers.
Yeah.
and I needed to learn their language. And the dean of the law school, that was my supervisor at the time, said, "May, you just have to learn the language of the law because you've got the medical knowledge. And once you learn the language of the law, you're not going to be worried when you go to court." And he was right. The same with the MBA. I happened to listen to the last part of the first session, and it's important for some clinicians to be clinical managers because we have to change the views of managers who aren't medics, managers who aren't nurses. And that's where I did my MBA, because I again happened to land on a clinical leadership role in my department leading. And if you're in a board of executives where they all have, they're all business educated,
Yeah.
and you don't understand what mandates and KPIs are and finance talks, I can't convince them the importance of paying for, all the things that are needed at the front shop. So I did my MBA so I could learn the language of the business. And I think it's important that every one of us sees ourselves as some sort of advocate, bridge, whatever it is that you want to call it.
Yeah.
And I think it's important as well that we listen to our families and young people living with diabetes. The bit about making the public aware is very important. If a patient of mine or a young person who comes to clinic and says, their teacher doesn't understand type 1 or type 2, said he's eating too many sweets. And that happens so many times. It's shocking.
Yeah.
But it happens. Or they're afraid to inject or use their pump in front view of everybody else. We go to their schools and we do a big, audience talk about type 1 diabetes, because that's how we support them to create awareness. I don't blame them sometimes. I really don't. It's a bit about being kicked out of the cinema last time. This is a long time ago, but I recently took Brendan to a Broadway show just a year ago. He was 17 and I was so nervous and frightened because I don't want to ruin the wonderful experience of somebody else who's paid an expensive ticket to watch a Broadway or a West End show. But I also want Brendan to have that same experience. So we prep him, we just prep him as much as we can. When we're seated, I tell everyone around us, he might be noisy, he might suddenly laugh. But, thankfully, as awareness gets more, autism awareness is greater, more people are more accepting of it. And the same with diabetes. If we educate the people around us, the schools, the teachers, then the young people, the child, the families will be less alone. They will have that power to actually educate the people around them as well. So I think that's a very important message, that whoever you are, whether you're a relative, parent, teacher, doctor, nurse, you can help do that, with very little effort, I think.
Can I just say, I wish that I had a doctor like you. So I'll give a little bit of backstory about me. I was diagnosed so I get 2 diagnoses as diabetic because my mum and dad were told when I was around about 6 months. And then when they felt I was old enough, my diabetic specialist nurse took me in a room and sat down and explained things to me when they felt I was old enough to be able to take control of my diabetes and do my JAGs and things. I wish I had a doctor like you that would have understood how I felt, because when I went to school, I used to get sent home from school at lunchtime because nobody in school wanted to deal with how to feed me and how to do things and checking blood sugar. So it was responsibility landed on my mum and me to go home from school and get all that. And I just wish that at the point when I was a kid, when there was nobody like me in my school, that I could have had a doctor like you that would have been willing to go in and sit down and educate people and help people understand more, because it would have made me feel more comfortable. So I just want to say from the bottom of my heart that I am so happy that I have had the opportunity to get to know you and get to speak to you, to see what changes you're making for people that were my age when they were getting diagnosed. And I just want to say thank you for everything you've done for everybody. And I'm getting a little bit emotional because this is things that upsets me, because I remember how lonely I was as a kid when there was nobody else there. So I just want to say thank you for everything you've done in creating awareness, not just for diabetes, for people that have got autism and deafness and things like that. I just want to say thank you so much, and I am sure everybody out there agrees with me that it has been an experience just to get to learn a little bit about your career and your understanding of diabetes. So I am going to pass you back over to Tom, who will finish up with the rest of the diabetes chat topics and just get to know a little bit more about you. But thank you very much for taking the time out and talking with us tonight.
Thank you, Gary, for your kind words. I just want to say it's not just me. It really is everyone around me that feels very much the same.
And I know that, and I should have said for all of you that are doing it, and I do apologise for that. But again, I just thank you all for all the support you're creating for kids with diabetes and people living with diabetes. It's just it just amazes me. But I will pass you over to Tom before I end up getting into a tangent and getting into a full-blown conversation with you about other things.
Thank you, Gary. Honestly, where do I follow with that? Absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. So, May, we're going to talk a little bit about your research and your books, Action for Diabetes, and hopefully a little bit about the NICE project of CGMs for all and the health inequalities to tech. So, obviously, in my intro at the start, I gave a brief overview of all the amazing things that you've done in your career. You successfully led multi-centered control clinical trials. You've served on the editorial board. You produced the 3 books that you've already mentioned this evening, over 150 plus peer review research publications, and you've spoke at many national and international meetings and conferences. So let's talk about your research a little bit more. And I'm interested, is there any sort of particular research areas that you'd like to maybe share, or is there anything that really passionates you about when you're doing your publications? Is there anything that stands out for you, or when you're speaking at conferences, is there any specific subjects that really intrigue you with diabetes?
Yes is the answer, definitely. So I spoke at the recent International Society of Paediatric and Adolescent Diabetes on the importance of health inequalities. And I think that's a theme throughout, isn't it? We know that the National Pediatric Diabetes Audit has had 6 to 7 years of consecutive widening gaps in health inequalities as to which child gets a pump. And I'm talking about also low deprivation areas compared to high deprivation areas. Big discrepancies, and this gap is widening year on year for the last 6 to 7 years. Same thing that we're seeing for continuous glucose monitoring systems. Interestingly, when I did the talk in Abu Dhabi, the US are seeing the same thing. Widening gaps year on year, which means the inequalities are getting worse every year. Nothing's being done about that in terms of, do we understand why it happens? How do we stop it? What is the foundations of that? So one of the research that will happen in the next year, which we recently got a grant on, will be looking at this. I'm also very interested, as you know, on technology. So I led on the NHS England closed loop trial for children and young people, the analysis of that, and that has been published a few months ago. And that was used on the basis for our NICE technology appraisal guidelines. The draft is still out, and many of us will be commenting and doing the feedback. Whilst there is a criteria that you only get it with an HbA1c of greater than 64 millimoles per mole, 8%, we disagree, those of us who are pediatricians. I chair the UK Children's Association of Children's Diabetes Clinicians, and same with British Society of Paediatric Endocrinology and Diabetes. We all feel that children and young people should not have this criteria. So I'm hoping that as many people as possible would feed that back, because we know that I have had, how many? 3 under 5s diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in the last 4 months. The number of very small children getting diagnosed under 5 is getting more and more. We know this because we have a robust, almost 100% submission of National Paediatric Diabetes Audit. We know that more and more getting diagnosed. We know that they're getting diagnosed younger and younger. And UK is one of the highest prevalence and incidence in all of Western Europe. I don't agree that we need to put criteria if for a 2-year-old to have an HbA1c of 8% before you get a closed loop. Because we've shown already, and I've published, I was lead author with my co-authors, I've published the NHS real-world closed loop trial of over 250 children, that all of them get better quality of life, better sleep, the carers get better quality of life, better sleep, and less hypoglycemia, and better HbA1c. So we've published the 6-month data. We're all collecting the 12-month data, which hopefully all the centers will submit and will analyze this. But it's important, and I sit on the NICE update guideline committee. I wasn't on the committee for the technology appraisal for closed loop. But we know that money isn't never ending. We know that we have to ensure that money is spent in a way that benefits the greater good, I suppose. And I know Leslie mentioned that NICE does look at something called quality adjusted life year. So that includes the quality and quantity of life lived, but doesn't quite still look at quality of life outcomes. PREMs and PROMs are not there because there isn't any for closed loop at the moment. The ones that we have at the moment has been based on the recent paper that we published. So, but we can't, NICE is a body that looks at evidence. It is a body that is part of the government's agenda to deliver high quality patient care. I wrote an interesting paper last year about its medical legal aspects of NICE. And there has been some precedent court cases that has won because, for example, a commissioning group hasn't followed NICE. But NICE is still not a legal expectation. Okay, so professionals do not have to rigidly follow it, but they can be open to jurisdiction if taken to court. So it's an interesting paper that I wrote in Diabetic Medicine. You can search for that. But it's important that NICE is there to give us the evidence. There is not overwhelming evidence, as you can see from the recent tech appraisal for closed loop systems. That's what they've deduced because it's still new. We don't have overwhelming evidence, but they have actually said that it is recommended as an option for managing type 1 diabetes. But at the criteria of an average HbA1c of greater than 8, and another criteria that companies at NHS England must agree a cost-effective price. So I don't know if you've noticed, those were the 2 big things that stood out. And we were asking many people to give that feedback. So a lot of research into tech still needs to be done because tech is still fairly new in terms of the world of research. We don't have masses and masses of overwhelming research to say that closed loop is going to improve life for the next, improve your life for the next X decades, or it will stop complications. We haven't got that evidence, but it's an expensive technology. And I mean, later on, if we'll talk about the other part of the world, the low middle income countries, they don't even have insulin. So how do you compare? But some countries do fairly well. In the UK, we were, on average, our HbA1c was 9.2% in 2010. That's pretty high. one of the highest in Europe. We're now down at about 8%.
And what's reduced the gap for that then? What would you
So
say?
that is over, gosh, 10 to 12 years of many initiatives. So there is a beautiful graph or slide that a lot of us like to show, and that includes best practice tariff. So more payment per year of care for children and young people living with diabetes. We've had the peer review quality assurance programs. We then developed diabetes networks to support best practice care and standardization of care. We've had many things. We've had QIs, quality improvements across networks. And all of this has been instrumental in driving greater improvements, upskilling, educating healthcare professionals, and actually providing technology to some extent. More pumps as well in the last 10 years. So all that has been driving our HbA1c towards a better HbA1c overall in our country. I mean, compared to Sweden, we're still terrible. Sweden has a national average of 7.3%. How do they do it? We don't know. We do know, but yeah. So Sweden is like our gold star to hit towards. So all this is important research that so research is still important. I have a passion for research, despite in my early days, I didn't go into an academic teaching hospital because of my career choices at the time. But that passion stays. So I have always done research. And interestingly, many people call it my hobby time. In fact, I have a lot of hobby time, meaning I'm paid in a lot of things, but all my research is hobby time because I'm a full-time clinician. I'm not an academic person, so I only do research in my own time. But these are important research which I feel needs to be done, so I do it. And the future is very bright. I mean, we know that smart insulins are being developed. We know that full loops are being developed. In the next 5 to 10 years, you're not going to have to carb count anymore. That's how they're going to advertise it. You don't need to bolus anymore. But until then, we need to find out how we can fund it. We need to keep ourselves healthy. We need to keep educating and upskilling the people around us, the healthcare professionals and the families and carers. So there's much work to do. I'd really like to say that we also need to remember that there are other parts of the world that hasn't got a lot.
Yeah.
And that is very important.
When we had Tino from Zimbabwe, he was telling us about how he still uses syringes, and it was such a surreal moment when he shared that with me, and I was blown away by it.
Yes, I met Tino in Abu Dhabi, and he's a wonderful guy that advocates for his country and his peers, and absolutely. And one of the papers that we published for Action for Diabetes in Southeast Asia was a full country's outcome, 5-year outcome in Laos, a little country next to Vietnam, Malaysia, Cambodia. And if you can imagine, in 2016, this is not long ago, right? 2016, there was no surviving type 1 person, not an adult. No surviving. That means if you got a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes, you will not survive. You do not get insulin in Laos. You do not get blood glucose strips. You do not get anything. It's unheard of, but these countries still exist. So most of Southeast Asia. And sometimes it breaks my heart when people bring me a box of unused insulin vials. Because the NHS is too wonderful, isn't it? It's just too wonderful.
Of course, absolutely. And hopefully we will see as the years come that the health inequalities, not only in the UK, we get more access and people have the options, but across the world, isn't it? And hoping in 5-10 years time, we're not having this conversation still and hearing people are in these situations. And I think that really leads on to Action for Diabetes. So I'd really like to let you share with everyone what Action for Diabetes is. I know Jerry's coming on as a guest speaker in March, I believe.
Great.
So I'm sure we'll have a very in-depth conversation. But can you share with everyone what Action for Diabetes is and your role as the voluntary chief medical advisor?
So Action for Diabetes is a UK-based charity, interestingly. So it's based in the UK and it's registered in the UK as a non-government organization charity. But it specifically supports insulin provisions, blood glucose kits, DKA therapy and funding, and sometimes even complications therapies like the need for eye surgery and things like that in Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asia is a little section of the world that covers Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and Philippines and Brunei. I grew up, as you know, so I'm a Malaysian ethnic minority Chinese. And many of Southeast Asian countries, bar Singapore, okay, are low middle income countries. And many of them do not have any universal health coverage for blood glucose strips. And many of the countries do not have universal health coverage for blood glucose strips or insulin. Action for Diabetes is this amazing charity that got in touch with me because they didn't have a medical person behind them to support them with some of the initiatives. And I think I happened to answer Jerry's very long email. He will say that to me. He said he tried many people, but I was the only one who answered. I was like, okay.
I'm familiar to Jerry's long emails.
But when I found out about it and I spoke to many of the team that are based in Southeast Asia, Fiona, who is their lead operational manager based in Kuala Lumpur, I was amazed at how much they do. They only had a team of 5 people and they were running operations and providing. They have to buy insulin from the industries to give it to the hospitals across Southeast Asia. Okay, they get it at a very small discount from the industries, which I can't name, but you know what insulin they are. And without Action for Diabetes, these children simply won't survive, because the wonderful thing about Action for Diabetes is when they take a child into their clinic support program, they guarantee the insulin and the blood glucose strips until they're 25 years old, because that is sustainable. That means we're not giving them just an ad hoc box of insulin or an ad hoc bunch of insulin pens that are not used, but they guarantee this until they're 25 years old so that they then have the opportunity to gain employment and keep themselves alive by buying insulin after that. And that is very important because it's sustainable. When I joined, we set up, it was during the pandemic time as well. We set up webinars. So we got a group of healthcare professionals across Southeast Asia countries to set up an advisory group to set up the educational programs, the resources to upskill the teams. We wanted to upskill patients and families as well. So Hello Type 1 was born. At the same time, Action for Diabetes had consistently tracked and their patients' outcomes. And I also set up virtual clinics with the doctors who, for example, have challenging cases. They're not sure how to change an insulin regimen. They're not sure how to monitor someone who may have neonatal diabetes and not type 1 diabetes. There are several things that we can do virtually now. But fundraising is a very important thing. And that is actually Jerry and Charles, the 2 founders. Their remit is to maintain the funds. And I know Diabetic Dad Paul is here, and he has done some wonderful fundraising from his part to support Action for Diabetes children as well. So thank you, Paul, if you're still here. So there's so much that I can say about Action for Diabetes. They also have SMIRE scholarship programs for when they reach after high school. Some of them want to be a tailor. We will support them to go into apprenticeship to be a tailor. Some of them want to be a cook. We'll do that too. So do go into their website, actionfordiabetes.org. Those are some wonderful things that they really do, and they sustain it, and that's the big difference. We've published 2 papers last year, closing the gap in Southeast Asia, and the average HbA1c in Southeast Asia was about 10.2%. So we're a long way trying to get this HbA1c down, because it does mean that many of them develop complications like loss of sight when they're in their late 20s. Some of them have foot amputations as well. Yeah, it's a very different world, I have to say, and I think it's important that we also advocate for better insulin for all, WHO global access to medicines in those of us who are in more privileged countries.
Absolutely, and I look forward to hearing more from Jerry in a few weeks' time when we catch up with him. I'm really interested in the programs and the scholarships. So thank you for sharing a little bit about Action for Diabetes and your role there. Just to conclude my section, really, because I think we touched upon some of the notes that I've put down regarding the OBE, and again, congratulations on that amazing award for you and your team. But I know you've had some amazing moments where you've met the Prime Minister and you've spoken at the House of Parliaments. Was it Theresa May by any chance? Was that in?
Yes.
It was Theresa.
Yes,
when I was doing my
a few years ago.
research, yeah, when I was doing my research, I was quite when I saw it was 2019, and I was trying to do the sums, and I thought, I suspect it was Theresa May with her background to diabetes and stuff.
Yes.
It'd make more sense. But I just want to, before we finish my section, is we've talked a bit about your amazing books. You've got 3 books. I just wondering if you could maybe summarize a little bit about each book, because I think in Gary's section, we did touch upon the background that you've got with autism. And I just wanted the opportunity for you to share a little bit about the books, and also the your recent book that you've obviously published last year, I believe, with diabetes related. So a guide to type 1 diabetes management, technology, and everything else you need to know. I just wondered if you could give us a sneak preview of the book, why you set it up, what motivated you to want to write it, and what sort of things can we expect in the book, and what do you want us to get out of the book? People who are living with diabetes. I can see Mary on the line, who's not only a person with diabetes, but a parent of a child with diabetes, but also from a clinical point, a healthcare professional point. What do you want them to get out of the book?
Okay, thank you for that. Like I said, I never set out to write it at the start. It sometimes just happens by serendipity. A Journey with Brendan came about because I was inspired to do that from families that I was looking after who didn't know where to go, who didn't know how to advocate for an EHCP, educational healthcare plan, who didn't know how to advocate to get a diagnosis earlier, or while they were waiting for a 2-3 year diagnosis, what could they do? And that book has a lot of top tips behind the journey that I went through. And it took me 10 years to write that, because it was, I like writing. I loved writing even as a child. So I used to write diaries as a little bit of an outlet. So A Journey with Brendan came about from putting that together. And it is not just for families and carers, it is also for healthcare professionals to be aware of what happens behind the scenes and how to put together the resources that are available to help families going through similar journeys. I even have a template of a legal letter at the back of A Journey with Brendan on how to write to the local
Incredible.
authority. you know,
Yeah.
and quote the exact Educational Legal Act. So, because
And
parents can't write, because parents and sometimes they don't know how to write a letter. So that's an example, because it's really difficult, and I've been through that, and I still go through a different journey now with Brendan at 18. And I think that's an important thing. It is really to help families, carers, and for healthcare professionals to be more aware. When I wrote Me and My Hormones, it was again another comprehensive account about underlying causes of all hormones affecting all ages from birth to adulthood. And again, this was put together from when I first started in my first job in the DGH, I set up the service for diabetes and endocrine, and there were no leaflets for anything, no leaflets for what normal puberty was, what normal growth, what timing, and then added on all the other endocrine disorders like pituitary, thyroid, weight issues, adrenal. So Me and My Hormones is a real comprehensive snapshot of all the hormone conditions, the treatments, the presentation, and it is for a reader that simply wants to know about hormones and what can go wrong in the body. And that again was put together because I'd already written all these many leaflets I keep churning out in clinic when I first started as first consultant. And the guide to type 1 diabetes management, technology, and everything else you need to do was again another inspiration, again from families who keep wanting to do, even though we keep producing leaflets. I really couldn't produce a leaflet about what MARD is, or what the different sensors were, or how would you read your glucose profile or a download. And I thought that there was a gap that needed to be fulfilled, because even though technology is evolving, the concepts and the foundations of diabetes technology is still there. You still need to understand how an insulin pump works. How would you change basal rates? You need to understand that there are different continuous glucose sensors, monitoring systems, or intermittent flash sensors. Why are they different? How are they different? Why should you expect that sometimes there is a 5-minute lag? Why should you expect that an interstitial glucose is not the same as a finger prick glucose? Why should you expect that each company that sells the sensors has a different MARD, for example? So, which is mean average difference in accuracy, for example. So on top of putting together a book about technology, I put together a book about everything else you need to know about type 1 diabetes. A one-stop shop, someone called it, a reference guide.
yeah.
And it is for anyone who wants to know more about type 1 diabetes. I think it's useful. My registrar thinks it's useful. My training thinks it's useful for medical students, for families, and it's got a very important section about solution focused approaches as well. So my whole team is trained on how to converse with families, how to support them in the language. And language does matter. We developed the Ormskirk model, for example, that's been translated to 29 languages now. I last heard people were using it in Cambodia, New Zealand, India. So we're excited about that. So Ormskirk model, you can Google it. I think we published this a few years ago, and it steers away from having HbA1c every 3 months as a test. Because we research, for example, I don't like this HbA1c thermometer thing, or red to green color range, because it feels like a test. So what if you're in the red? So we changed it, and we used language to discuss the HbA1c. It's really important, because I had a patient a few years ago. He thought the diabetes clinics, he transferred from another clinic, but he thought his diabetes clinic was for his parents. We were like, no, it's for you. And he was like, it is? I said, yes, it's all about you and all about what you want to talk about and how we can help you. And I think that's, so it's in there as well, HbA1c, how to discuss that. And not a traffic light system, not a thermometer, not a red to green flagged system, but simply a language used. So I suppose that's as much as I can say. It's a book about everything.
Is it?
Place it on the packet. It's a book about everything you need to know.
Yeah, and I think it's really helpful, like say, not only for someone living with diabetes, but a parent, for example. And I think these sort of holy Bibles, I guess, would be so helpful and so supportive to everyone. But I can imagine when I was diagnosed 17 years ago, having this sort of book would have been really helpful, not only to me, but my mum and my parents. So yeah, guys, go check it out on May's website with all her amazing publication stuff and all the fascinating journeys. So you can go check that out. Thank you so much, May, for speaking to us this evening. We're just going to round up with a question or two from Kez, who's going to just talk about mental health and peer support. But yeah, over to you, Kez.
Yeah, actually, that's something that I'm really passionate about. It was interesting to hear what you said about the difficulties of navigating education as such with VHCPs and things like that. I'm a social worker with children. I deal with that all the time, and it is just a minefield. It's absolutely mad. But I think I just wanted to ask, really, what are your thoughts around kind of managing or supporting mental health, particularly for young people with diabetes, and actually their parents as well, if they're not living with the condition themselves?
Hi, Kaz. I think that's extremely important. In fact, one of the most important things is once you have the basic necessities, so insulin is life-saving. So in some countries, we've got to give them the basic necessities. But here, I'm very lucky. My team has 2 psychologists. We offer psychology time to anyone who needs it within a very short space of time. We offer parents psychology sessions without their young child if they need it, because we feel that that is an important aspect of even a newly diagnosed child. Well-being, sometimes it's not mental health, but really just well-being. Living well with diabetes can be challenging at different stages of their lives. It can be challenging when they move from primary school to high school to university, and any time in between. So I know it's been mentioned in many forums how important peer support is. So we are very lucky as well. Many years ago, we have already had a peer support group within our catchment, the Lancelots, and a lot of them support each other, and we make sure they know that this support group's there. In the last 2 years, we've been doing the STEPS program. So we call it Solution Focused Education with peer support and psychology. So our psychologist and our educator goes into the schools and supports the young person. If there's more than one, then we hold the group education session. So simply to let them know each other, first of all, but then we do simple sort of structured diabetes educations in schools, and sometimes they're teachers and their best mates. And mental health, living well, well-being, they're all very important, because without that, you lose that momentum, I suppose, because diabetes is all-encompassing, isn't it? It affects from the time that you wake up, even when you're asleep. And if you have a pump, you've got to manage the pump and the CGM, or if you have injections, you've got to finger prick multiple times. It occurs at school, it doesn't, occurs at clubs, Girl Scouts, brownies, etc. So that is so important, that the people around them are educated and are aware of what is needed. It's important for that young person and their parents to feel supported by the team that's treating them or giving them advice on changes in insulin regimens or pump changes. But at the same time, we want to also make sure that our psychologists are supporting them as well. Because my psychologist will always say, I'm not going to talk any numbers. It's about how you're feeling today, what's important, what matters to you today. And actually, we start that clinic together, you know, what matters to this young person that particular time. It could be that he's going for a Scouts badge at the time. You know, it can be anything. It's not DHbA1c. And then that's the message. That comes when everything else falls in place. So living well with diabetes is actually one of the chapters in the book that I wrote. It's an important aspect. It doesn't mean you have a mental health issue. It means that you choose to live well with diabetes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it really does. I think kind of leading on from that, what I'd be really interested to know is, I think, as I said, I work as a social worker with children, and we've had an increase of children being referred into services for safeguarding issues that are relating to their diabetes. And I've got a very different view to that on the other 50 people in my office who don't have diabetes. But what could other people be doing to support children and families who are in that situation?
I think depending on who you're talking to, if it's a relative, if it's a friend, it's simply asking them how they are, being interested in if they're wearing a technology, or just saying, you know, hey, that's cool. It can be anything. I can't describe the many anecdotes I've had. I've had a young person, you know, every 3 months I may have one or two young person that I will offer them everything. Pump, CGM, loops, everything. And he'll go, no, I'll think about it the next time. And I'll say, well, I'll keep asking. And one day we did the STEPS program at school, and another young person, similar age, was showing him his closed loop. And he's like, it's great. It's very cool. And the next thing he goes, well, I want one too. And I said, well, I've been asking you for the last 2 years. So I think it's about just being interested in that person and that diabetes is part of their lives. For the parents, is giving them respite. I have many parents who are very overwhelmed. They feel they can't leave their young child alone with anyone, even with grandparents sometimes, because they feel that they're the only ones who can manage the pump or the sensor or whatever it is. And it's giving them that confidence that, hey, you know, we can help you. We will do all the training we need for grandma, granddad, auntie, etc. So in different ways we can help the families, and we try to do that as much as we can. But sometimes talking to our psychologists, we uncover what are the fears that they have.
Yeah, I think fear is a massive part of it, isn't it? It's like the
Yes.
unknown. So I suppose just to finish off, what would your top tips be for a family or a young person who's been newly diagnosed?
My top tip is how I've lived my entire life. So when my son got diagnosed with autism, I learned everything I could about autism. I researched autism. I wasn't an autism specialist, but I literally became one. And my second son was born deaf. I was a deaf advocate. I learned British Sign Language. I learned how to teach him to speak and, you know, lip read eventually. And I think sometimes if you have the time, I suppose, I think look it up, read up about it, be curious, I think, be curious. And many times I agree, sometimes we live in a little bubble. We don't know that there are many other people who aren't aware that there's something called the Libra 1, Libra 2, Libra 3 is coming up. There are many who don't know what a CGM is or what a pump looks like. And for us who do know it, we should advocate for them to be aware of this. And for those who are newly diagnosed, my top tip is really to find out more about the condition. Be curious, learn more about it, and then ask questions. If you're not getting the answer that you think you're getting, ask somebody else. Because there's always a spectrum of, and I think I heard it at the start, there's a spectrum of clinicians, there's a spectrum of healthcare professionals, and, you know, you can always ask someone else, get a second opinion. But be curious.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's really good advice. I think that's something that I did myself when I was diagnosed. I mean, I was diagnosed as an adult, but I didn't really know anything about diabetes until I'd been diagnosed, and then had to go and look it all up because of COVID. So yeah, I think that's really good advice. I don't have any more questions. Tom, have you got any at all?
Yeah, I just think it comes back to that. I totally agree with what you're saying, May, and is talking and sharing them lived experiences and not feeling alone, and working with people to help manage your diabetes care. When I look back now, I wish I took on some of the advice that you've just said, May, and some of the advice that I've just mentioned myself. But I know it's easily said and done. But I think it just comes down to me is sharing and talking and sort of embracing it and trying to not feel alone and embarrassed but yeah, thank you so much for this evening, May, for coming on. It's been a tremendous evening on the diabetes chat. Getting to know you. Kez started with a bit of fun with our 90-second questions, and then Gary caught up with you and spoke about your connection to diabetes and your background, and you mentioned your connection as well with autism and your third child death as well. And then we talk amazingly about all your research and books and some of the things that you've been working on and what you are working on now, and then Action for Diabetes. And then I think just to conclude this evening, Kez caught up with you and spoke about peer support and mental health. So I honestly think it's been really fascinating. When I actually wrote the questions, because I write some questions, I send it out to the team, and there were so many questions, and I thought to myself, I think we could literally fill like a day's worth of content, because you're such an incredible person. It's been truly amazing connecting with you this evening, and it's your first ever diabetes. Well, no, it's your first ever Twitter Space. So I'm
It is.
I'm so grateful it's worked. But honestly, it's been really good, really fascinating. Gary, was there anything else you wanted to finish with? And guys, just get on the Twitter later on and send some tweets or let us know what you thought. If you have any questions, just tag May in it, and I'm sure she'll get back to you. Or just let us know what you thought of this evening. If you've read any of her amazing publications or books, or go check it out.
All I want to say is thank you so much, May, for coming on and gracing us with your presence and your wealth of knowledge and plethora of information about how you're trying to make changes for multiple people within disability communities. We are so grateful for it. I also want to just ask, because I don't think any of us have really asked it, and I think I should have potentially asked it, where can people find your work? Can you link them to a website or something?
I think my peatsdoc.co.uk website will have my books. So it will take you to the Amazons or Bookwall's website if you're interested. But thank you so much. I just want to say thank you for asking me. It was my first Twitter chat space, and I was like, how do we do this? And but I'm really honored. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.